Welcome to The Bee's Knees, a podcast wild about native bees. Wild and native bees are under threat worldwide. In each episode, we look at actionable things we can do to support these adorable little guys whose pollination work is crucial for maintaining biodiversity. I'm JC Meyer, and I thank you for being here. Bees are essential partners in keeping our ecosystems and food systems running. But while managed honeybee colonies are thriving under human care, many wild bee populations are struggling. And that imbalance is raising important questions about biodiversity. On Giannutri Island in the Mediterranean, researchers found a rare chance to study this dynamic up close. By temporarily closing managed honeybee colonies, they could see how wild bees responded in real time, from changes in nectar and pollen availability to shifts in foraging behavior and even longer-term population trends. In today's conversation, Dr. Lorenzo Pasquali joins us to share what he and his team discovered, why it matters for conservation, and how it could shape the way we think about balancing managed hives with wild pollinators. Set the scene for us, please. Can you describe Giannutri Island?
Yes. So to imagine how Giannutri Island is here we first start from the position of this island in the Mediterranean Sea, because it's quite isolated from other islands, and the mainland is 10 kilometers apart from all other land. And Giannutri Island is in a half moon shape. So, and its surface is 2.6 square kilometers. So it's very, very small. And from one tip of the island, you can easily see the other tip of the island. And you can just 40 minutes walk, you can just visit all the island. And it's really impressive because there are no cities, no roads. So it's just nature and some house, because let's say from autumn to spring, only 10 people lives on the island. So it's quite no people, isolated, and the environment is amazing because it's all Mediterranean shrubland or some woodlands. And in some areas, you can really, just walking by, you can really smell the rosemary, like a small heaven in the Mediterranean Sea. And yes, during the early spring, when I was there to do this study, there were only researchers, some people living there, and bees and birds. That's it. So it's really isolated. You feel like really on an adventure, I'd say. But it's a beautiful adventure.
A beautiful adventure is an absolutely perfect way to describe it. So what inspired you to study the relationship between managed honeybees on this island and the wild bees?
Yes, actually it's a bit less poetic than the island description, because all the island is protected by the Tuscan Archipelago National Park. And in 2021, the National Park wanted to monitor the pollinator diversity on the island according to the European Pollinator Monitoring Scheme. And so they asked the University of Florence and Pisa, I was working at the University of Florence, to start this project. And in the meeting to arrange all the stuff to start the program, the idea of addressing the issue of the presence of honeybees came out by like a group brainstorming, let's say, because there is a bit of growing body of literature addressing this topic. So we said, okay, we will monitor the pollinator abundance, and in addition, we would like to understand if there is competition between honeybees and wild bees on the island. So I'd say the idea came out immediately from a conservation perspective, because it's a small island, so every potential stressors could be quite impactful. So we need to experimentally study this topic. We also contacted the beekeepers. The honeybees are on the island from 2018. And the beekeepers bring the hives in December, and they remove them in June. And they do this for economical, of course, reasons. And every year, the beekeepers has to ask for a permission to bring the hives to the national park. So we made this agreement with the national park and the beekeepers, in which we said, okay, the national park will give you the permission to bring the hives for the next 3 years at least. It was 2021. And in exchange, the beekeepers had to help us in the experimental study and teach us and allow us to close the beehives temporarily. And that's the core, the most important part of the study, the possibility to close the hives and study this topic.
So tell us, what happened when you did temporarily kind of close up the honeybee hives? What did you notice right away?
Yeah, the first non-scientific thing that we saw, but it was really impressive, it's the soundscape. Because you can imagine it's a small island. We did these experiments from February to the beginning of April. And in this period, there were, we estimated an abundance of honeybees of let's say 500,000, more or less 500,000 total in this period. So it's a lot of honeybees. And by walking on the paths that are on the island, you can really hear all the honeybees buzzing around. And we pass from this situation to closure of the hives, total silence. So really the soundscape is really the first thing that you notice. And after that, by paying a little more attention to the details, you can start hearing the buzzing of the wild bees. So in our case, the two most abundant, Anthophora dispar and Bombus terrestris. And you can also recognize them by the buzzing sound because it's quite different. So I'd say that for me, but also for my colleagues, the buzzing sound was the first thing that's, immediately noticed as a difference. Then that's a personal experience. From a scientific point of view, that's also what the National Park wanted also. We saw from the data a really statistical evident difference between the data collected in the presence of honeybees and in the absence of honeybees. Maybe I need to specify that the honeybees were kept closed from 1 day. So from 1 day, if we cannot keep them closed for too long, otherwise they will die, of course. So we need to alternate some, open hives, closed hives, and so on. And by collecting all the data, we saw that when honeybees were closed in the hives, there were a higher abundance of pollen on flowers, there was a higher volume of nectar, and in response to the lower exploitation done by honeybees, the wild bees changed their foraging behavior. They actually, let's say, summing up all the foraging activity, I'd say that the wild bees improved their foraging time in absence of honeybees. With this, I mean that they can make more foraging trips during the day, and because there are, of course, more resources on flowers, so they can find them easily, so faster. And at the same time, in the absence of honeybees, the wild bees were able to obtain more nectar from the flowers, because we were able to measure the time that each wild bees forage on a single flower to collect nectar. And we know that this time is correlated with the amount of nectar taken. Of course, it's quite logical, but we also demonstrated that. So, and when honeybees were not there, this time was longer. So it means that there were more nectar for the wild bees to collect. So all these data were from independent also observations, because they are not a single experiment. There are many different observations, techniques, and methods. And all the methods point to the same direction of a really impact of honeybees. So we notice, from a human perspective, we notice a difference in the soundscape and also from visual clues on the flowers. But from a wild bees perspective, the absence of honeybees created more food, more opportunity, and also more wellness, I'd say, of course.
So, do you have thoughts on how we could better balance managed hives and wild pollinators?
Understanding that it can have an impact on the environment, and after we have acknowledged it, we can start regulating for example, the honeybee hives density in some areas. Of course, this can be done in protected areas at first, at least, because protected areas are areas that are devoted to protect biodiversity. So the human impact should be minimized. And regulating the honeybee density in that area is one of the steps needed to minimize their impacts. And of course, not all the protected areas are the same. For example, in our case, Giannutri Island was a particular case because it's an island, so it's a closed environment, isolated. So every effect that honeybees can have is incremented because the wild bees were not able to find food so far from the hives because there are no food in the sea, of course. Maybe so in the mainland, all the honeybees, the wild bees can go farther away from the hives to search for food. So it's really also context dependent. And what we hope is that in many protected areas, the policymakers starts to increase the knowledge about their pollinator diversity, abundance, and by evaluating also the specific context, regulate the honeybee density. But we do not want to pass the message that we are against honeybees. There are no good bees and bad bees, evil bees. There are just wild bees, managed bees, but we can really hope that we can make them live together in a sustainable way without creating enemies, but creating allies. Let's say that.
So, in all your time with working with bees, has there been a discovery that made you feel like a bee hero, like you were really making a difference?
Well, bee hero is a strong statement, but I'd say two moments when I felt like a bee hero. It was during because we did this study for 4 years in total. Actually, 5 years because we continued also this year. So let's say 4 years. And during the first year, which also was my first PhD year, at the first day, I started questioning, okay, I have to be on this island for a month. That's a long time, isolated only with colleagues. What am I doing here? So we started doing the experiment, observing the behavior of the bees, taking measurements of the volume of the nectar and flowers. And just randomly, in a moment, on a day, I felt, okay, but I'm doing this not just for the sake of doing this. I'm doing this for a purpose, for helping this wild bee population. So, wow, it was quite impactful for me to realize when I was on the field that I'm doing something to help the conservation of wild bees. And that was really amazing, I'd say. And the second moment was 1 year ago, maybe something more, when we showed all the results we had to the national park in another meeting. The national park said, okay, we have these results, and they took the decision to not give their authorization to the beekeepers to bring the honeybees on the island. So from our study, the national park make an evidence-based conservation action, actually, that was not allowing the beekeepers to bring the honeybees to the island. And also, we, with the other colleagues, we started understanding, wow, so we have done something practical. We are doing something to help this population. We cannot know yet if it has been a positive impact because we need some time. There's some time lag between the conservation actions and the positive results that we can see. But we are very curious about that. So also we replicate also in this year, 2025, we replicated the measurements we did, the observations we did in a condition of prolonged absence of honeybees, because there were totally no honeybees on the island, and we replicated all the measurement, and we are planning to do also in the next year to see if this decision of the national park had a positive impact. So I'd say, and we felt somehow like a bee here, like to protect the wild bees.
Congratulations. I absolutely think that qualifies you and your team as bee heroes. This study gave rare conclusive evidence of how managed honeybees compete with wild bees. Even brief removals boosted nectar and pollen availability, improved wild bee foraging, and revealed the pressure honeybee colonies place on fragile ecosystems. Over just 4 years, wild bee populations declined by 80%, with honeybee competition the most likely driver. In a world where climate change and habitat loss already strain pollinators, high hive densities can amplify those impacts, especially in sensitive places like islands and national parks. The takeaway is clear. While many threats to wild bees are beyond our control, competition with honeybees is one we can manage. This research calls for careful limits on beekeeping in protected areas and sets the stage for broader studies to safeguard biodiversity. Thanks to Lorenzo for sharing the beautiful buzz of Giannutri Island with us, and to you for joining in the adventure. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean a lot if you could share it with a friend. Thank you, and until next time, stay balanced.